During a simple checkup, Delilah O'Neill expected care, not cruelty. But the doctor, cold and full of hate, sneered at her. His words stung, but what he did next was worse. With a flick of his hand, he knocked over the urine sample, spilling it all over her. The shame burned deep. But when Shaquille O'Neal heard what happened, he didn't just get angry, he acted. And what he did to that doctor, it left the whole country in shock. Before continuing, let us know where you're watching from. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel. Let's move on to the story. The automatic doors of Parkland Memorial Hospital slid open with a faint hiss as Delilah O'Neill walked inside, leaning slightly on her wooden cane. At 78 years old, she was still strong-willed, but age had taken its toll. Her caramel-brown skin was marked with fine wrinkles, and her silver hair was neatly braided under a soft blue headscarf. Despite her aching joints, she held her head high. Years of raising a family had taught her never to show weakness. "Miss O'Neill?" a nurse called from the reception desk. "That's me, sugar," Delilah replied with a warm smile. The young woman, Angela Brooks, smiled back. She was in her late 20s with dark brown skin, sharp cheekbones, and intelligent eyes that had already seen too much in this hospital. Her curly black hair was pulled into a ponytail, and her blue scrubs were slightly wrinkled from a long shift. "I'll take you to your room," Angela said, gently guiding Delilah down the hallway. "Just a routine checkup, right?" "That's what they tell me," Delilah said. "But I don't trust these folks. Doctors ain't what they used to be." Angela chuckled. "I hear you. Some of them forget we're human." Delilah sighed. "It ain't just some, baby. It's the ones who got power." Angela didn't reply, but she knew exactly what Delilah meant. They reached the examination room, a cold white space with a stiff hospital bed and a beeping heart monitor. Angela helped Delilah onto the bed and adjusted her pillow. "You need anything before the doctor comes in?" Delilah waved her hand. "Just hurry up and get this over with." A few minutes later, the door swung open. In walked Dr. Bradley Henshaw, a tall, lean man in his late 50s with slicked back gray hair and piercing blue eyes. His white coat was spotless, and his expression was one of quiet arrogance. Angela tensed the moment she saw him. Dr. Henshaw had a reputation. He was one of the hospital's most respected physicians. But among the staff, especially the black nurses, his name carried a different meaning. They had seen the way he treated certain patients. Henshaw didn't greet Delilah. He barely looked at her as he flipped through her chart. "You're here for a checkup on your blood pressure and kidney function, correct?" "Yes, sir," Delilah replied, watching him carefully. "Lie back," he instructed, his tone clipped. He moved to insert an IV into her arm. "Careful now," Delilah said. "My skin bruises easy." Henshaw exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. "If you stay still, I won't have a problem." Angela watched from the corner, her hands clenched into fists. She knew that tone. Henshaw shoved the IV in, rough and careless. Delilah winced, and a small bruise immediately formed around the needle. "Lord, have mercy," she muttered. "You got hands like a butcher." Henshaw barely acknowledged her. Instead, he reached for a small urine sample bottle on the counter. He checked the label. Then, without warning, his hand tipped, and the container fell onto Delilah's lap. The warm liquid spread across her hospital gown, soaking into the sheets. A stunned silence filled the room. Angela gasped. "Oh my God!" Delilah's eyes widened in horror. "What in the hell?" Henshaw didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he scoffed, shaking his head as if she had caused the accident. "Next time, don't be so clumsy," he muttered. Angela's breath caught in her throat. Delilah, usually calm and composed, felt rage rise in her chest. She sat up, her voice trembling with anger. "Excuse me, you think this is funny?" Henshaw grabbed a paper towel and tossed it onto her lap. "Clean yourself up," he said flatly. "We're done here." Angela felt her heart pounding. She had seen this before, this exact moment in different forms, happening to different patients who looked like her. But this time, something inside her snapped. She subtly reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and hit record. Delilah was still shaking as she wiped at the stain on her gown. "I want to speak to someone in charge," she said. "This ain't right." Henshaw smirked. You can complain all you want, ma'am. No one's going to care. Angela had heard enough. Doctor, Henshaw, that was uncalled for. His head snapped toward her. Excuse me? She deserves an apology. His eyes narrowed. Do you know who you're talking to, Nurse Brooks? Angela squared her shoulders. A doctor who just humiliated an elderly patient for no reason. Henshaw stepped closer, lowering his voice. Watch yourself. You're replaceable. Angela didn't back down. Instead, she looked at Delilah, then back at Henshaw. She forced a smile. Have a nice day, doctor. Then she turned and walked out. As soon as she was in the hallway, she stopped the recording and saved it. Her hands were shaking. She had no idea what she was going to do next. But she knew one thing. This wasn't over. Delilah O'Neill sat in the stiff hospital bed, her hands gripping the damp paper towel Dr. Henshaw had tossed at her. The humiliation burned deeper than the cold urine staining her gown. She had faced racism her whole life, but something about this moment, being treated like nothing, being dismissed like she was invisible, hurt in a way she hadn't expected. Angela Brooks stood beside her, jaw tight. Miss O'Neill, do you want me to get someone? She asked softly. Delilah nodded, her voice raw. I want to speak to the hospital administrator. Angela didn't hesitate. I'll get them. She left the room, her heart pounding. 15 minutes later, Angela stood in the office of Susan Willard, the hospital's lead administrator. The room was cold and professional, with neatly stacked folders and a large window overlooking the parking lot. Susan was a middle-aged white woman with short blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. She was known for keeping things quiet, for making problems disappear before they could damage the hospital's reputation. Angela told her everything. She left nothing out. Dr. Henshaw's carelessness, his cruel remark, and how he had tossed a paper towel at an elderly woman as if she were nothing. Susan listened without expression. When Angela finished, the silence in the room stretched. Then Susan sighed. Are you sure Miss O'Neill didn't misunderstand the situation? Angela stiffened. Misunderstand? Dr. Henshaw spilled urine on her and blamed her for it. Susan's fingers tapped against the desk. Dr. Henshaw is one of our best physicians. I don't care if he's the best surgeon in the country, Angela shot back. What he did was wrong. Susan's expression remained neutral. I'll look into it. Angela had heard those words before. She knew what they really meant. Nothing will happen. Meanwhile, in Delilah's room, another nurse entered, a white woman in her 40s with a forced smile. Miss O'Neill, she said, adjusting the IV stand, I heard there was a little accident. Delilah narrowed her eyes. An accident? That man disrespected me. The nurse's smile didn't falter. Doctor, Henshaw's very busy. Maybe he was just rushed. These things happen. Delilah scoffed. I've lived long enough to know when someone's looking down on me. The nurse folded her hands. Well, the best thing is to move on. Stress isn't good for your health. Delilah stared at her. You telling me to let it go? The nurse hesitated. I just don't want you to be upset. Delilah exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. Get me my son, she said. Right now. The nurse frowned. Your son? Delilah gave her a pointed look. Shaquille O'Neal. Call him. The nurse's face paled. Angela returned to Delilah's room a few minutes later, her hands still shaking from her meeting with Susan. They aren't going to do anything, she admitted. They'll cover for him. Delilah sighed, unsurprised. I figured. Angela hesitated. Then she pulled out her phone and opened the recording she had secretly taken. I have this, she said. I recorded everything. His voice, the way he spoke to you. I can show it to someone. Maybe a lawyer. The press. Delilah held up a hand. Not yet. Angela blinked. But I need to talk to my grandson first, Delilah said. Angela frowned. Your grandson? Delilah smiled, despite everything. You'll see soon enough. In a sleek, glass-walled penthouse in downtown Atlanta, Shaquille O'Neal sat in his home office, scrolling through emails on his tablet. Even in retirement, his schedule was packed. Endorsement deals, charity events, business meetings. But no matter how busy he was, there was one person he always made time for. his grandmother, Delilah O'Neill. His phone buzzed. Mom. He answered immediately. Hey, Ma, what's up? On the other end, Lisa O'Neill took a shaky breath. Shaq, it's your grandmother. His stomach clenched. What happened? Lisa's voice cracked. It's bad, baby. She went to the hospital for a checkup, and the doctor, he humiliated her. Shaq sat up straighter. What do you mean? Lisa struggled to explain through her tears. He spilled something on her, treated her like dirt, called her clumsy and threw a napkin at her like she was nothing. Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. Who? Some doctor named Bradley Henshaw. Shaq's jaw clenched. He didn't know Henshaw, but he knew the type. Rich, arrogant, the kind of man who thought power made him untouchable. I'm on my way, he said. Shaq arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital within the hour, his massive 7 feet 1 inch frame, making the small hospital staff shrink in his presence. His dark brown skin glistened with sweat from the Atlanta heat, and he was dressed in all black, sweatpants, a hoodie, and sunglasses. He walked straight to the receptionist. I need to see Delilah O'Neill. The young woman behind the desk stammered, her eyes wide. Our room 214. Shaq nodded and strode down the hall, his heart pounding. Inside the room, Delilah sat upright in bed, looking as dignified as ever despite the stained hospital gown. Beside her stood Angela Brooks, the young nurse who had witnessed everything. Lisa was there too, wiping her eyes. Shaq stepped inside. Granny, Delilah looked up. Shaquille. He bent down and kissed her forehead. Tell me what happened. Delilah sighed. It's not just about me, baby. This doctor, Henshaw, he's been doing this for years. I know it. Angela stepped forward, clearing her throat. She's right. He mistreats black patients, ignores them, rushes procedures, talks down to them, and the hospital covers for him. Shaq looked at Angela for the first time. You saw it happen? Angela hesitated, then pulled out her phone. I recorded it. Shaq's eyes darkened. Show me. Angela pressed play. Henshaw's voice filled the room, cold, dismissive, full of quiet cruelty. Shaq listened, his fists clenching tighter with every word. By the time the recording ended, his breathing was heavy. Lisa whispered, Shaq, what are we going to do? Shaq exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had enough power to destroy this man overnight. One tweet, one Instagram post, and the world would tear Henshaw apart. But that wasn't enough. He wasn't just going to ruin Henshaw. He was going to expose him. First, Shaq said, his voice steady, we're gonna dig. Angela frowned. Dig? We find out everything about him, Shaq said. Every patient he's hurt, every complaint that got buried, every secret he's hiding. Lisa looked at him, concerned. Shaquille, this isn't your fight. Shaq turned to her. He made it my fight. Angela nodded slowly. I know someone who can help, a retired detective. He used to investigate medical malpractice cases. Shaq's lips curled into a small smile. Call him. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war. A dimly lit diner sat on the outskirts of Atlanta, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. Inside, at a corner booth, Shaquille O'Neal leaned forward, his massive hands folded on the table. Across from him sat Angela Brooks, nervously glancing at the entrance. Beside her was Detective Raymond Foster, a grizzled man in his early 60s. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and deep lines ran across his dark skin, the result of decades spent investigating corruption. He had retired from the force years ago, but the fire in his sharp brown eyes was still there. Shaq took a slow sip of his water. Angela says you know how to dig up dirt. Raymond smirked. I know how to find the truth. Shaq leaned back. Good, because we need to find out everything about Dr. Bradley Henshaw. Raymond nodded. I did some digging already. Henshaw's been at Parkland Memorial for over 20 years. No public scandals, no lawsuits, at least not officially. Angela scoffed. That's because the hospital covers for him. Raymond tapped his fingers against the table. Exactly. But I found something interesting. 10 years ago, a black patient named Robert Carter died in Henshaw's care. His family tried to sue, claiming negligence, but the case was dismissed. Shaq frowned. Why? Raymond slid a file across the table. Because the hospital paid them off. A quiet settlement, no media attention. Angela's eyes widened. How many others? Raymond exhaled. That's what we need to find out. Shaq picked up the file, flipping through the papers. We need more proof. Witnesses, other victims. Something big enough that they can't cover it up this time. Angela hesitated, then said, There's someone else who might help. Dr. Michael Patel. He works at the hospital. He's been trying to expose corruption there for years. Shaq nodded. Get him on board. Raymond smirked. You planning to go public? Shaq's gaze darkened. Not yet. First, we bury Henshaw in his own lies. Angela's stomach twisted. She had never imagined she would be sitting across from Shaquille O'Neal, planning to take down a corrupt doctor. But as she looked at the determination in his eyes, she knew one thing. This wasn't just about Delilah anymore. This was about justice. The next morning, Shaq sat in his private study, scrolling through pages of notes Raymond had compiled. The deeper they dug, the uglier it got. Dr. Henshaw's history was riddled with quiet settlements, dismissed complaints, and patients who mysteriously never got justice. Angela had already set up a meeting with Dr. Michael Patel, but Shaq wasn't waiting. He wanted real voices, people who had suffered under Henshaw's care. He picked up his phone and dialed the first number on Raymond's list. It rang twice before a woman answered. Hello? Miss Carter? This is Shaquille O'Neal. A pause, then, What? Shaq took a deep breath. I'm calling about your father, Robert Carter. I know he died under Dr. Henshaw's care. I know the hospital paid your family off. I need to know the truth. Silence, then a shaky voice. My father wasn't sick. He went in for routine surgery, a simple gallbladder removal, and he never woke up. Shaq clenched his jaw. What did they tell you? They said it was complications, but when we asked for his medical records, half the pages were missing. Shaq leaned forward. Did you ever talk to other families? Miss Carter hesitated. There was one other woman. Her son died in that same hospital, under Henshaw's care. Shaq grabbed a pen. What's her name? 2 hours later, Shaq, Angela, and Raymond sat across from Marie Thompson, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a sorrowful expression. She clutched a worn photograph of her son, Jamal. He was only 24, she whispered, her voice thick with grief. He went in for a bad cough. They misdiagnosed him, said it was bronchitis, sent him home with some pills. Raymond frowned. And what happened? Marie swallowed hard. 2 days later, he collapsed in our living room. We rushed him back to the hospital, but it was too late. She wiped her eyes. It wasn't bronchitis, it was pneumonia. His lungs were full of fluid. Shaq's chest tightened. And Henshaw was his doctor? Marie nodded. I tried to fight it. I screamed at that hospital, but they made me feel like I was crazy. They said, things like this happen. They made me believe I had no choice but to let it go. Shaq exhaled slowly. You do have a choice now. Marie looked up, her eyes searching his. Raymond leaned in. We're building a case. If we can get enough people to speak up, they can't cover it up this time. Marie hesitated. Then she straightened her shoulders. If it means no other mother has to feel this pain, I'm in. Shaq exchanged a look with Angela. One by one, they were gathering voices, and soon the world would hear them all. Dr. Michael Patel sat across from Shaq, Angela, and Raymond in a quiet coffee shop, his fingers drumming against his cup. He was a tall, lean man in his early 40s, with neatly combed black hair and sharp brown eyes that flickered with both intelligence and frustration. I've been waiting for years for someone to take down Bradley Henshaw, he muttered. Shaq leaned forward. Then tell us everything. Dr. Patel sighed, rubbing his temple. Henshaw isn't just a bad doctor. He's dangerous. He doesn't make mistakes. He makes decisions. Decisions that kill people. Angela frowned. What do you mean? Patel took a slow breath. I started at Parkland Memorial 12 years ago. Even back then, I noticed a pattern. Black and low-income patients were always the ones receiving the worst treatment, the ones who waited the longest, the ones whose concerns were ignored. Shaq's jaw tightened. Patel continued, his voice low. But there was one case that haunts me the most. Raymond grabbed his notepad. Go on. Patel hesitated. 5 years ago, a patient named Eric Winslow, a 38-year-old black man, came in with severe chest pain, classic signs of a heart attack. He swallowed hard. Henshaw took one look at him and said, "It's probably stress. Send him home with some painkillers." Shaq felt his stomach drop. And? Patel exhaled sharply. Eric died 6 hours later. Massive heart attack. Angela covered her mouth, horrified. Oh my God! Patel shook his head. His wife tried to sue, but the hospital buried it. They changed his records, made it look like he refused further testing. Raymond scribbled notes. Do you have proof? Patel nodded. I kept copies of his original test results. His ECG showed clear signs of heart distress. I warned Henshaw, but he didn't listen. Shaq's hands curled into fists. You have those records? Patel reached into his bag and slid a folder across the table. Right here. Shaq opened it, scanning the documents. The evidence was damning. Angela whispered, This is it. This is huge. Raymond smirked. With this, we don't just have a pattern, we have a cover-up. Shaq closed the folder. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with fire. Henshaw's done. The air was thick with tension as Shaq, Angela, and Raymond pulled up outside a small, rundown house on the outskirts of town. A rusted truck sat in the driveway, and the porch light flickered weakly. This is Troy Henshaw's place, Shaq asked, stepping out of the car. Raymond nodded. Bradley's younger brother. They haven't spoken in years. Angela glanced at the peeling paint on the front door. Why would his own brother turn on him? Raymond adjusted his jacket. Because Troy knows something, and I'm betting it's big. Shaq knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then heavy footsteps echoed from inside. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s. His face was weathered, with gray creeping into his scruffy beard. His blue eyes flickered with recognition when he saw Shaq. You're Shaquille O'Neal, he muttered, rubbing his face. What the hell do you want? Shaq didn't waste time. We need to talk about your brother. Troy scoffed, shaking his head. I figured this day would come. He pushed the door open wider. Come on in. Inside, the living room was cluttered but comfortable, with old newspapers and beer cans scattered around. Troy grabbed a whiskey bottle from the table and poured himself a drink. So, he muttered, sinking into a chair, you want to know the truth about Bradley? Angela nodded. Whatever it is, we need to hear it. Troy took a long sip, then exhaled. You know, people always thought he was the golden child. Smart, successful, the perfect doctor. But they don't know what I know. Shaq leaned forward. Which is? Troy's eyes darkened. Bradley killed a man. Silence. Angela's breath hitched. What? Troy nodded grimly. Back in the 90s, when he was still a young doctor, a black patient came in. David Reynolds, I think his name was. Routine procedure. Nothing complicated. But Bradley, he screwed up. Gave the wrong dosage of anesthesia. Shaq's stomach twisted. And the patient died? Troy nodded. Yep. But instead of admitting his mistake, Bradley covered it up. The hospital helped him do it. They changed the records. Told the family it was unforeseen complications. Paid them off to keep quiet. Raymond's pen scratched against his notebook. And you're sure of this? Troy laughed bitterly. I was there when he told my father about it. He was bragging, said it was the hospital's fault for hiring unqualified staff. His jaw clenched. That was the day I knew he was a monster. Angela shivered. And you never told anyone? Troy exhaled. I tried, but my father shut me down, said we had to protect the family name. He shook his head. I left after that. Haven't spoken to Bradley in years. Shaq exchanged a look with Raymond. This wasn't just about medical negligence anymore. This was manslaughter. Shaq stood up. Troy, would you be willing to say all this on record? Troy hesitated, then sighed. Yeah. He looked Shaq in the eye. I've been carrying this for too long. Angela exhaled in relief. This could be huge. Raymond nodded. With this, we're not just exposing a corrupt doctor, we're bringing down everyone who protected him. Shaq clenched his fists. Then let's finish this. The city skyline shimmered against the night as Shaquille O'Neal stood on the balcony of his penthouse, phone pressed to his ear. Across town, Raymond Foster sat in his dimly lit office, cigarette smoke curling around him as he spoke. It's time, Raymond muttered. Shaq nodded. Yeah, let's blow this wide open. Earlier that day, Angela Brooks had sent the files to every major news outlet. Henshaw's history of negligence, Dr. Patel's proof of the cover-ups, and Troy Henshaw's damning confession about his brother's past crime. It was enough to shake the entire Parkland Memorial Hospital system to its core, but Shaq wasn't just waiting for reporters to pick up the story. He was taking matters into his own hands. The next morning, Shaq sat across from Lisa O'Neal, his mother, in their family home. She was still reeling from the pain of what had happened to Delilah. But when she saw the fire in her son's eyes, she knew something was happening. We're going public, Shaq said simply. Lisa inhaled sharply. You're sure? Shaq nodded. No more silence. She reached for his hand. Then let's do it. That afternoon, Shaquille O'Neal went live on Instagram. Millions of followers tuned in as he sat in front of the camera, his expression unreadable. He held up a folder, the same one containing the evidence against Dr. Bradley Henshaw. I need y'all to listen, he began, his deep voice steady but heavy with emotion. This ain't about basketball. This ain't about fame. This is about my grandmother, about all the people who suffered because of one man who thought he could get away with it. He flipped open the folder. Dr. Bradley Henshaw has a history of mistreating black patients. He ignored them. He let them die, and the hospital covered it up. The comments section exploded. Shaq continued, his voice tightening. This man should not be a doctor, and I promise you, he won't be for much longer. Within an hour, every major news outlet was reporting the scandal. Henshaw cover-up started trending on Twitter. Headlines splashed across the internet. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal exposes corrupt doctor hospital under fire for negligence and cover-ups. Former patients speak out, he let my son die. The city of Atlanta was buzzing. Parkland Memorial Hospital released a weak statement saying they would conduct an internal review, but no one was buying it. Then that evening, a bombshell dropped. Dr. Bradley Henshaw was placed on indefinite leave. Angela's phone rang. It was Shaq. We did it, he said, but his voice wasn't celebratory. It was calm, focused. Angela exhaled. It's not over yet, Shaq smirked. Oh, I know. Because taking down Henshaw was just the beginning. The streets outside Parkland Memorial Hospital were filled with a sea of people. Angry voices echoed through the city as protesters held up signs. Justice for Delilah. Hold Henshaw accountable. Black lives matter in healthcare too. It had been less than 24 hours since Shaq exposed Dr. Bradley Henshaw, and now the entire country was watching. Angela Brooks stood near the front lines, gripping her phone as she filmed the massive crowd. I never thought I'd see this, she whispered to Shaq, who stood beside her, towering over everyone. Shaq nodded. They're done covering this up. At City Hall, Mayor Susan Carlton stepped up to a podium, cameras flashing in her face. A blonde woman in her 50s, she was known for being careful with her words, but today, there was no escaping the pressure. The allegations against Dr. Henshaw are serious, she stated. I have personally spoken with the hospital board, and I can assure you that a full investigation is underway. Reporters fired questions at her. Mayor Carlton, do you support the protests? What about the other victims? Will they get justice? But before she could answer, her aide rushed to her side, whispering urgently. Her face paled, because the governor had just announced a state-level inquiry into Parkland Memorial Hospital's history of discrimination. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was about to become a reckoning. Back at the protest, Detective Raymond Foster pulled Shaq aside. We've got a problem. Shaq frowned. What now? Raymond handed him his phone. Look at this. On the screen was a leaked email, one sent from a high-ranking hospital official to a team of lawyers. We need to contain this. Find a way to discredit O'Neill and the so-called victims. Shaq's blood ran cold. They're trying to turn this on us, Raymond muttered. They'll claim Delilah was confused, that Angela faked the video. Anything to save themselves. Shaq clenched his jaw. Then we hit them harder. Angela's voice came from behind them. We're not just fighting one man. We're fighting a system. Shaq nodded. Then let's make sure they never forget this fight. Dr. Bradley Henshaw paced inside his dimly lit home, gripping a glass of whiskey so tightly his knuckles turned white. His once pristine suit was wrinkled, his face unshaven. The news cycle had torn him apart, and now his own hospital had placed him on indefinite leave. They turned on me, he muttered, seething. His phone buzzed on the table. He snatched it up. Unknown number. Who the hell is this? He snapped. A smooth voice responded. Bradley, you're finished. Henshaw's breath hitched. He recognized the voice instantly. Troy, his brother, the one who had betrayed him. You little... Save it, Troy cut in. Your career is over. You should be glad I didn't come forward sooner. Henshaw's grip tightened on his phone. You don't know what you've done. I know exactly what I've done, Troy shot back. And I'd do it again. Henshaw slammed the phone down, breathing heavily. He turned to the TV where Shaquille O'Neal was being interviewed on national news. Doctor, Henshaw was protected by a corrupt system, but now he's running. Henshaw's face burned with rage. He was not going to be destroyed like this. Parkland Memorial Hospital, late evening. In a sleek, glass-walled boardroom, the hospital's top executives sat in silence. Dr. Alan Weaver, the hospital director, rubbed his temple as his team whispered among themselves. This is a disaster, one muttered. They're calling for his arrest, another said, nervously adjusting his tie. Dr. Weaver sighed. Then we do what we always do. The room went quiet. We distance ourselves. We release a statement condemning his actions. Make it clear that we had no part in his behavior. A woman at the table hesitated. And if the investigation uncovers more? Dr. Weaver's gaze darkened. Then we make sure it never does. Meanwhile, outside Henshaw's gated mansion, a black SUV idled near the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing lights of a nearby news van. Inside, Detective Raymond Foster sat quietly, watching the house. His partner, Officer Marissa Lewis, adjusted the police scanner. You think he'll run? Raymond smirked. Henshaw's a coward. He won't run, but he'll hide. And Raymond intended to make sure he never came out. The press conference room was packed. Journalists, photographers, and activists filled every seat, the air buzzing with anticipation. At the front of the room, a massive banner hung behind the podium. Justice for Delilah. Justice for all. Shaquille O'Neal adjusted his tie, standing behind the curtain as Angela Brooks handed him a stack of notes. You ready? She asked. Shaq exhaled. Yeah. Angela smirked. Good, because the whole country's watching. As Shaq stepped onto the stage, the cameras flashed wildly. He looked across the sea of reporters, cleared his throat, and began. I never thought I'd be standing here, he said, his voice deep and steady. I never thought I'd have to fight for my own grandmother to be treated like a human being. The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. Shaq held up a folder. This is bigger than one doctor. This is about every black patient who has been ignored, mistreated, or lost their life because of negligence. He took a deep breath. So today, I'm announcing the creation of the Delilah O'Neal Healthcare Justice Fund. Gasps filled the room. Shaq continued, his voice unwavering. This fund will provide millions of dollars to help families who have suffered from medical racism. It will support investigations, legal battles, and reform in hospitals across the country. A journalist raised a hand. Mr. O'Neal, are you saying you're taking on the entire medical system? Shaq looked straight into the cameras. I'm saying I'm not stopping until this system changes. The internet exploded. Where Shaq fights for justice trended worldwide. Celebrities, athletes, and activists pledged their support. But most importantly, victims began coming forward. Stories poured in, families who had lost loved ones, nurses who had seen corruption firsthand. Dr. Michael Patel called Shaq that evening. "You just made history, my friend," Shaq exhaled. "Now let's make sure it means something." Because this fight wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about change. The courtroom was silent as Dr. Bradley Henshaw sat at the defense table, his once confident posture replaced with tension. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Clinton Reese, whispered something to him, but Henshaw barely nodded. Across the aisle, Shaquille O'Neal, Angela Brooks, and Lisa O'Neill sat with their legal team. The weight of the moment pressed on all of them. The judge, a stern-looking black woman named Judge Eleanor Matthews, cleared her throat. "This hearing will determine whether there is sufficient evidence to move forward with criminal charges against Dr. Bradley Henshaw." Henshaw swallowed hard, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. The lead prosecutor, Damon Wilkes, stepped up to the podium. "Your Honor, the evidence against Dr. Henshaw is overwhelming." He turned to the jury. "Over 20 documented cases of medical neglect, false medical records, and worst of all, proof that Parkland Memorial Hospital covered up patient deaths under his care." A screen lit up behind him, displaying the hospital's internal emails. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Wilkes pressed on. "We also have a recorded statement from the defendant's own brother, Troy Henshaw, detailing a wrongful death cover-up from the 1990s. Lisa O'Neill squeezed Shaq's hand. This was it. Clinton Reese rose. "Your Honor, my client is the victim of a witch hunt. He is a respected doctor who has saved countless lives." Judge Matthews raised a brow. "Yet we have proof that he ended several." Reese shifted uncomfortably. "My client maintains his innocence." Judge Matthews leaned forward. "Then he'll have the chance to prove that at trial." Henshaw's face drained of color, because that meant this wasn't ending anytime soon. As soon as the hearing ended, the media swarmed. Reporters threw questions at Shaq. "How do you feel about the charges?" Shaq simply looked into the cameras. "This isn't just about one doctor. It's about all of them who think they can get away with this." Angela Brooks nodded beside him. "And we're just getting started." Because Dr. Bradley Henshaw was going to trial, and this time, he was the one fighting to survive. It had been months since Dr. Bradley Henshaw's world collapsed. The once respected surgeon was now jobless, disgraced, and awaiting trial. But fate had a cruel sense of irony. One evening, as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, nursing a bottle of whiskey, a sharp pain ripped through his chest. He gasped, clutching at his shirt. The pain intensified, his vision blurred. He tried to stand but collapsed onto the floor. A single thought raced through his mind. Not now. Not like this. With the last of his strength, he reached for his phone and dialed 911. The paramedics rushed Henshaw through the doors. The very place where he had once ruled as a doctor was now the only place that could save him. Nurses moved quickly, setting up monitors. One of them, Angela Brooks, froze when she saw his face. It took her a second to process it. Dr. Henshaw, the man who had humiliated Delilah O'Neill, the man who had ruined lives, and now he was helpless. Dr. Michael Patel entered the room, glancing at the chart. His eyes narrowed when he saw the name. Bradley Henshaw. He turned to his team. "What's his status?" A nurse hesitated. "Severe heart attack. He needs immediate surgery." Patel exhaled. A lifetime of anger boiled inside him. He had watched this man destroy Black and immigrant patients with his negligence. Now fate had placed his life in Patel's hands. Angela noticed Patel's hesitation. "You're not seriously considering letting him die?" Patel clenched his jaw. "After everything he's done? Maybe this is justice." Angela stepped forward. "Number justice is holding him accountable, not becoming him." Silence. Then Patel sighed and turned to the team. "Prep him for surgery." Because unlike Henshaw, they took their oath seriously. Hours later, Henshaw awoke in a hospital bed, the steady beep of a heart monitor beside him. His throat was dry, his body was weak, and standing at the foot of his bed was Angela Brooks, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You're alive," she said flatly. Henshaw swallowed hard. Angela leaned in. "You spent your career treating us like we were less than human." She gestured around the room. "And yet, the only reason you're breathing right now is because of us." Henshaw looked away, ashamed. Angela shook her head. "You don't deserve it." She turned to leave, then paused. "But maybe now, you'll finally understand what it means to be powerless." And with that, she walked out, leaving Henshaw alone in his silence. Dr. Bradley Henshaw lay motionless in his hospital bed, the weight of his own helplessness pressing down on him. He was alive, but something inside him had broken. The room was cold, sterile, the very kind of hospital room where he had ignored the suffering of so many others. Now he was the one being ignored. Dr. Michael Patel stood outside Henshaw's room, arms crossed, deep in thought. He had just saved the life of a man who had spent years making life unbearable for others. A younger doctor, Dr. Rebecca Harris, approached cautiously. "Dr. Patel, what's the plan for Henshaw's recovery?" Patel let out a slow breath. "Legally, we have to treat him. Ethically, that's another question." Rebecca hesitated. "Some of the staff don't even want to treat him." Patel nodded. "I can't blame them." Silence hung between them. Then Patel straightened. "But we're not him. We're doctors. We do our jobs, no matter how much we hate the patient." Angela Brooks walked through the halls, still processing what had happened. The same man who had once endangered lives now depended on the very people he had oppressed. She stopped outside Henshaw's room and peered inside. He looked small, weak, nothing like the powerful man who had once terrorized the hospital. He turned his head and saw her. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something. Angela stared for a moment, then shook her head. She had nothing left to say to him. Outside the hospital, protesters still gathered. News cameras flashed. The country wanted to know, would Parkland Memorial Hospital allow Bradley Henshaw to return? Inside, the hospital board held a private emergency meeting. Dr. Alan Weaver, the hospital director, sat at the head of the table. "We have a decision to make," he said. "Henshaw is out of surgery. Do we reinstate him once he recovers?" The board members glanced at each other. Then one woman, Dr. Lillian Carter, spoke up. "Are we really debating this? The man is facing criminal charges." A man at the table, a senior executive, frowned. "But if we fire him now, he could sue." Dr. Weaver tapped his pen against the table. After a long pause, he said, "Then let's make sure he won't want to come back." The next morning, a nurse walked into Henshaw's room with a file. "You've been discharged," she said, setting the papers down. Henshaw blinked. "What?" The nurse didn't meet his eyes. "You'll have to find another hospital for your follow-up care. You're no longer welcome here." She turned to leave. Henshaw's voice was hoarse. "They can't do this." The nurse paused in the doorway. "Doctor, you did this to yourself." And with that, she walked out, leaving him in the cold, empty room. For the first time in his life, Dr. Bradley Henshaw had no power left. The city was buzzing. News of Dr. Bradley Henshaw's downfall had spread like wildfire. The once powerful surgeon was now jobless, disgraced, and awaiting trial. His career was over. But for Shaquille O'Neal, the fight wasn't over yet, because this wasn't just about bringing one man down, it was about changing the system. At a massive rally in downtown Atlanta, thousands of people gathered. Signs filled the air. "Justice for Delilah." "End racism in healthcare." "Protect Black patients." Shaq stepped onto the stage, looking out at the sea of faces. He took a deep breath, then spoke. "My grandmother, Delilah O'Neal, was humiliated in a hospital that was supposed to take care of her," he said. "But she wasn't the first. And if we don't change things, she won't be the last." The crowd roared. Shaq raised a hand. "That's why today I'm announcing the next step in the Delilah O'Neal Healthcare Justice Fund." He paused, letting the moment sink in. "This fund won't just pay legal fees for victims of medical racism. We're going to train and support more Black doctors and nurses. We're going to fight for laws that hold hospitals accountable." The energy in the crowd was electric. Shaq wasn't just calling for justice. He was building a legacy. Inside Parkland Memorial Hospital, Angela Brooks stood in front of Dr. Michael Patel. hands clasped. Patel smiled. Angela, you didn't just do the right thing. You changed lives. Angela blinked. Are you? Patel nodded. The board has decided to promote you to head of patient advocacy. Angela's mouth fell open. From now on, Patel continued, your job will be making sure no patient ever goes through what Delilah did. Tears filled Angela's eyes. For years, she had felt powerless. But now she was in a position to make real change. At Shaq's mansion, Delilah O'Neill sat in the garden, wrapped in a warm shawl. She sipped her tea, watching the sunset. Lisa O'Neill sat beside her, smiling. How are you feeling, Mama? Delilah exhaled. Better and proud. Lisa took her hand. Shaq did all this for you. Delilah shook her head, smiling. No, baby. He did it for all of us. Justice had been served, but more importantly, change had begun. It was a quiet evening at Shaquille O'Neal's mansion. The storm had passed. The fight had been won. But tonight wasn't about headlines or victories. It was about family. Shaq sat on the back porch with Delilah O'Neill, watching the sunset. The sky burned with hues of orange and purple, casting a golden glow over the garden. Delilah sipped her tea, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. You did good, Shaquille. Shaq smiled softly. I just did what you taught me. She chuckled. Oh, so now you listen to me. They both laughed, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them. Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the sky. You know, I thought taking down Bradley Henshaw would be enough. But it's not just him. The system is broken. Delilah nodded. And now you're helping to fix it. He sighed. I just don't want this to happen to another family. Delilah reached over, placing a wrinkled hand on his. And because of you, it won't. The Delilah O'Neill Healthcare Justice Fund had already raised millions. Laws were being proposed. More Black doctors and nurses were stepping into the field. Angela Brooks had changed the hospital. Dr. Michael Patel had exposed the corruption. And Bradley Henshaw? He was gone. His career was over. His power stripped away. Shaq had started this journey seeking revenge, but he ended it by building a legacy. Delilah sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. You know, Shaquille, justice ain't just about punishing the guilty. Shaq turned to her, listening. She squeezed his hand. It's about lifting up the innocent. He let those words sink in. Then for the first time in a long time, Shaquille O'Neal felt at peace. Because this wasn't just a fight, this was the beginning of real change, and they had won. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. Also, subscribe the channel for daily stories notification. See you soon until next story. Stay safe.